hand over to David.
Great, thank you very much indeed, and welcome to this session on social mobility, topical on the day in which the Social Mobility Commission has published its latest report, which shows the extent of the challenge that we face in our education system. I think before I introduce our three main speakers who are going to summarise their views on this issue and then take questions from you all in the audience, it's worth a bit of context, and sometimes you need that context on days like this where all of the focus is on the negative things that are inevitably picked up about social mobility. Actually, if you look at the progress that's been made by successive governments over the last decade, we can see that both in the school system and in the HE system there have been some real successes in improving social mobility, improving access and narrowing the attainment gap. In our school system, the gap between young people from disadvantaged backgrounds on the pupil premium and other students has narrowed by almost 25% in a decade, which I think is quite a significant achievement when you think about some of the context, the economic context around that period of time. The improvement, sadly, has been much less at the end of secondary education, where the attainment gap has only narrowed by about 12%. So many of those youngsters from more disadvantaged backgrounds are not getting the sets of qualifications that they would need to easily gain access to higher education, particularly to some of the higher performing institutions. There's also been progress in HE, obviously, in spite of the changes to student funding and the amount of cost that students have to pay themselves. We've continued to see an improved participation in HE by young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds against the predictions of some of those who were very concerned about the new fees regime that came in from 2011 onwards. But in spite of those improvements, we have to set all of those changes within their context. The context, firstly, that there is a massive disadvantage gap remaining in the school system. Young people entitled to the pupil premium, our sort of key measure of disadvantage, will end up 19 months of learning behind at the end of Key Stage 4 when they've taken their GCSEs, in spite of all of the interventions over the last couple of decades. And in some parts of the country, that figure is as high as 2.5 years, disadvantaged pupils behind all of the other non-disadvantaged pupils. We also, when we look, as we have done at the Education Policy Institute, at the most disadvantaged young people, those whose parents have been in poverty for long periods of time, discover that there's been no improvement at all in the gap between their performance and their non-disadvantaged peers over that period of a decade. So we've done quite a lot for those people who are disadvantaged but less disadvantaged. We've done nothing at all, really, to close the gap for the most disadvantaged. And we also know that in spite of the improved access in general to HE, it remains the case that access to our most prestigious institutions often has not improved very materially over the last decade, that they're still preponderantly accessed by those people who have been accessing them for many decades from the higher income groups. And we also know that we have significant problems with retention of some of the disadvantaged youngsters who aren't getting into our HE system. So there are many issues there for the three extremely well-qualified members of our panel. And the first to speak on this issue is Les Epton, Director of Fair Access in Offa. Les.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, both from you, David, and from Alex. It's good to be back at an independent HE conference again. And as David's pointed out, very timely with the Social Mobility Commission reporting today and the launch of their annual report, which confirms once again that where you're born, what your parents do, your ethnicity all determine your chances of success in life. And really that shouldn't still be happening in 21st century Britain. The Secretary of State for Education has referred to this country as having a social mobility crisis. And one of the bright spots within that, as David has mentioned, has been higher education. we have now the highest number of young, disadvantaged students studying full-time in higher education that we've ever had. Yesterday, Claire's organisation, UCAS, published some figures which showed the highest rate of entry to higher education from disadvantaged into 18-year-olds into full-time higher education ever. And the job of the Director of Fair Access, which I hold, was established by Parliament to ensure that despite the higher levels of fees, that access to higher education for disadvantaged and underrepresented groups would be safeguarded and indeed enhanced. And we do that through access agreements at the present time, and I sign off at the moment some 200 access agreements every year, and they're subject of some fairly protracted negotiation in some cases before I do approve them. But since access agreements were introduced some 10 years ago now, we've seen a staggering 73% increase in the numbers of 18-year-olds from disadvantaged, most disadvantaged parts of the country entering full-time higher education. Last year, 19.5% of that demographic went into higher education compared to 11.2% just 10 years ago. But it still means that you're 2.4 times more likely to be in higher education if you come from those most advantaged neighbourhoods in our country compared to the most disadvantaged. And indeed, that's an advance, but an advance from 3.7 10 years ago. So we've still got further to go. And one of my hopes is that members of independent higher education providers here will be able to help us to improve that record significantly. I know that many of you have good records on access and participation, and so I'm hoping that as that sector grows, it will mean that more and more people get the chance to enter higher education. I also want to mention that I've been talking only so far about young full-time students. If I included part-time students, the picture is very different. There has been a 61% drop in mature and part-time students since the introduction of higher fees. And often those students come from the most disadvantaged parts of the country. And again, I hope that independent HE providers will be able to help with that as well. I also want to say it's not just about getting in, it's about getting on. And it's a disgrace that you're less likely to get a first or a 2-1 if you come from certain parts of the country, if you are black, if you suffer disadvantage. That really should not be that your class of degree is determined by your background in that way, even when you enter with the same A-level grades as more advantaged students. And it's also true that when those students go into the world of work, they're less likely to get professional employment than those from the more advantaged neighbourhoods, despite perhaps having obtained better degrees than classes of degrees than the others. And again, I hope that alternative providers with, in many cases, their strong links with employers will be able to do something about that particular disgrace, that we can level the playing field there, something I know you're very keen on doing. My role as Director of Fair Access comes to an end on the 1st of April when the Office for Students forms. The offer will become part of the Office for Students, and a Hefke colleague, Chris Millward, will become the new Director for Access and Participation, recognising a greater emphasis on getting on as well as getting in future. And together we'll be writing some guidance for what is now called an Access and Participation Plan. And some of you may be particularly interested in that, because if you get approved to have an access and participation plan, then you join that part of the fees register, which is called the fee cap part, and your students will be eligible for funding, loan funding of up to £9,250 for fees. We don't know how many will apply. One of my hopes is that I might get a hint today as how many people will apply, so that I can put the right resource in there. We expect to be able to issue guidance in February as to what will be an access and participation plan, those with early application deadlines will hear by July which part of the register they're on, others by September as to which part of the register that they're on. So we're very happy to take questions about that. But I hope there will be a number of you that want to commit in that way to furthering access and participation, will want to partner in ensuring that where you come from, what your parents did, or your ethnicity no longer determine your chances of success in this country.
Les, thank you. That was a great start. After the three speakers, we'll come back to put questions to you, and there are a number of things we want to pick up on from your presentation, particularly now that your term is coming to an end on the 1st of April, so we're sure that you feel able to be extremely indiscreet and open with us today. So thank you very much. Our second speaker, Claire.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to the first IHE conference. I started in July. I thought I'd just cover three things in the 5 minutes I've got. Firstly, why social mobility and a focus on it is so important still. Secondly, I suppose a personal perspective in terms of what I think is absolutely central to our approach moving forward. And thirdly, some of the relationship between organisations like UCAS, but not exclusively UCAS, and yourselves moving forward, and how we can perhaps innovate better and evaluate better in this space. So firstly, in terms of why, I mean, I was looking at data just yesterday, and it doesn't really matter which of the measures you use, so whether you use POLAR and the POLAR sort of data, or you use the new, more holistic measure of deprivation in terms of our multiple equality measure, somewhere between 2.5 and 4 times more likely for those that are more advantaged to go to university than those that are least advantaged. So regardless of the measure you use, and I do believe the MEM, the multiple equality measure, is a better measure, more holistic measure moving forward, that is 4 times, difference in terms of most advantaged, disadvantaged. So I think, the fact that it is still an absolute issue means that it needs to stay on all of our radars. I also think there's a tendency that in the dip that we're going to see in terms of the 18-year-old population through to 2020, which you will all be aware of, and then it starts to come back up by 2023, there is a potential for us to take it for granted. With more students being able to access into HE, it's more of a buyer's market. Actually, we take our eye off the ball in terms of this. And then thirdly, and I was talking to a group of higher education institutions yesterday, I think there's a real a demand for us to think about what is working and cause and effect here. Because actually, I visit lots of different institutions who've got lots of outreach work, they've got lots of recruitment activity going on, working with different schools, but understanding the cause and the effect and whether it's having the necessary effect that they want, I think is something we can all still get better at. Just in terms of a couple of things that I personally believe are absolutely fundamental to our focus on this in terms of social mobility, but particularly student, learner outcomes moving forward. I come from 8 years in local government, and one of the things I learned there is that this has to be geography specific. And so, really understanding that what works in one set of schools and a relationship of one higher education institution with that set of schools may not work in another geography. And so really understanding a place-based approach to what works here. Understanding as higher education providers the sorts of pressures that are on schools and what they're dealing with. So whether that's, financial, and I'm sure, lots of sectors are looking at financial considerations, Ofsted, safeguarding considerations, academies, etc. Really playing with all of those and then understanding the role of, I met with a load of advisors. So these are, people who are dealing with 15, 16-year-olds. And for some of those 15, 16-year-olds are the only people that that they come into contact with who are going to raise their aspirations to think about higher education. So if those advisors at secondary school aren't having those conversations very early on, then we've really lost it by the time we start looking at 17-year-olds. I've got a 9-year-old. I know now that he's in a group of friends who have already decided that university is not out of reach for them. So right back into primary, in the primary schools I used to work with, having those conversations about aspiration is absolutely important. But it must be place-based, so it must be higher education institutes working with the colleagues and partners in that place. The other thing I think is it has to be evidence-based, and I'll just touch on that. And when I say evidence-based, it's about trying things and understanding cause and effect. One of the things that we're doing at the moment, working with about 12 different institutions up and down the country, is a pilot, and saying actually if we can work with a cohort of 40 or 50 potential applicants and say using analysis, can we actually see that we would change potentially grade offers or something for those 40, 50 per institution without having a detrimental effect overall on tariff points for that institution? Can we do something different? Now it takes a full year to look at that, but it's really important then, okay, we've done something different, what is the effect it's had before we roll it out? So I do think evidence-based is really important, getting the right measures, and also having measures that are what I call all through. So it's all very well as UCAS sitting here and having a measure around multiple equality, but I'm very keen to work with partners from HESA, HEXU, looking at actually from school through to career, what are the measurements that we can see all the way through in terms of data sharing. I absolutely support Les's point about mature students. I am very concerned 4 or 5 months coming into this sector about that, that continuing trend and probably a forecast trend around reduction in terms of mature students coming in and getting really underneath some of the speculation around why they're not entering. You know, is it because they've already gone? Is it because the economy is better? Is it because they're more debt averse? But trying to explore some of those. Finally, I think I'll just touch on in terms of support. I think there's something for organisations like UCAS, but also all of yourselves as higher education institutions, to really think about what I call Generation Z and the generation afterwards, and how we are going to work with those most disadvantaged or advantaged, but particularly disadvantaged in terms of them accessing information, advice, guidance, because actually how any of us in this room access information, advice and guidance will not be how my 9-year-old accesses it in 7 or 8 years' time. And so starting to think about the sort of, whether it's social media and Snapchat, and I sometimes say that to universities and they look at me like I'm talking a different language, but you know, Alexa, who gets a lot of conversation in my household, you know, but starting to think about the use of AI and how we're going to engage with those 17-year-olds, particularly from deprived backgrounds, is absolutely fundamental moving forward. And I see UCAS as playing a role as a partner in the sector to enable that. Not forgetting it about advisors, but the other key thing for me, and this is where UCAS but colleagues in HESA particularly can help, is around data and making the data accessible to all of you and to sector partners in a more broad sense. It's one of the unique things about UCAS, that transparency, an almost real-time nature of the data, but making it super accessible. And being able to innovate. One of the reasons I wanted to come here today is you are of a size that we can innovate together, try things, evaluate them, see if they work. If they do, roll them out to a broader audience. If they don't, say, well, let's try something different. So looking forward to working with you over coming years.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. And one person who will be most definitely interested in evaluation and evidence-based policy making is our third speaker, Emran Mian, who we're delighted to have with us today and who is leading for the Department for Education on the development of the social mobility strategy. Emran.
Thank you, David. And it's good to hear that that's your impression of civil servants, that we are led by data and by evaluation. So I agree with a lot of what's already been said by the other panelists, but that's a very dull way in which to open, isn't it? So I've got to find something to go beyond it. I won't pick disagreements just for the sake of it. Instead, I'll focus on kind of drawing out a couple of challenges, I think, based on some of the things that they've said. The first one, I think, is a challenge for us in government, working in partnership with others. And then the second, I think, is a challenge which is just as much for you guys as providers of higher education. So on the first one, the challenge for us as government, and I think very much underlined by the Social Mobility Commission report that was published this morning. The Social Mobility Commission is independent, and we in government don't always agree with their conclusions, or indeed all of the conclusions of the report this morning. But one conclusion we definitely do agree with is the focus that they place in their analysis on the role of places. And when you take a place-based lens on thinking about social mobility, you unearth what I think is a really significant challenge for us in government with partners to think about. So to give an example, they generated a social mobility index, which essentially takes a range of indicators across the education life cycle, and then the outcomes that young people go on to have in the labour market, and use it to generate a ranking of areas in the country, on the one hand, which are hotspots, where education is contributing to social mobility, and then on the other hand, cold spots, where that isn't the case. And the coldest of cold spots is West Somerset. And I mention West Somerset because it's one of the 12 areas that we've identified in the Department for Education as opportunity areas. And opportunity areas is kind of one of these slightly classic government euphemisms, where essentially opportunity areas are areas where we don't think there are currently sufficient opportunities. And West Somerset is one of those areas, and I think today's finding from the Social Mobility Commission just underlines for us how important it is that we need to work in West Somerset. And the challenge, when you look at it closely in West Somerset, is it starts very, very early. So you observe a very large gap at a very early age between children from advantaged backgrounds and disadvantaged backgrounds. And there's very little cause for comfort that the school system is then contributing to closing that gap. It's not clear that it is making a very substantial contribution in doing that. And then you see that reflected in not just the outcomes that those young people then go on to have in the labour market, but even in, for example, how young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds are much more likely to be excluded from school, much more likely to have mental health issues. So all kinds of challenges that they're experiencing, which the care and education system is currently inadequately helping them to cope with. And so the challenge for us in an area like West Somerset is, well, we've put some additional money on the table. That's part of the Opportunity Areas programme. But I've got to say, and I'm responsible for the Opportunity Areas programme in the department, a lot of this is not so much about the money, but it's about getting the right group of people around the table and getting them to acknowledge the scale of the challenge that they're facing. So in another one of our opportunity areas, which I won't name because of what I'm about to go on to tell you, the biggest challenge has been that there's been a pervasive pattern of schools excluding young people, especially secondary schools, and essentially passing the difficult young person onto the school down the road. And I think probably the single most significant thing that we'll end up doing in that area is we got all the head teachers in a room together and we got them to agree that they're going to stop doing this to each other. It was really hard to get them around the table. Some of them didn't want to be around the table at all. Really hard to get them to agree to it. But that's the most important thing. So, we will spend money in that area too, and we'll spend money on kind of supporting educational opportunity at every level, the early years, in school, advice, which Claire was talking about. A lot of young people in these areas don't feel that they're getting the right advice and that they don't feel they're getting planning for their career. They're not getting the help that they want for that. But I think in some of these places, it's just about getting the right people around a room and getting them to make a commitment that they're going to do things a bit differently. So I think that's the challenge for us. I think the challenge for us is kind of picking up what the Social Mobility Commission has described again in their report this morning and really kind of making this place-based approach work. And I think it's going to be hard. The challenge for you, if I may, as HE providers, I think is twofold. I think one is that you obviously make a very significant contribution to social mobility by helping young people, and not only young people, but people all across the life cycle come into higher education, acquire valuable knowledge and valuable skills. Now you do that, and that's your contribution to social mobility. I think the challenge you face is that a lot of the time that isn't perceived as you doing it for social mobility. I think the challenge, and perhaps is particularly the case at the moment, there's a lot of criticism around about higher education, and I think some of your recruitment efforts are perceived as you growing your business. So it's quite interesting. When elite institutions do access, it's perceived as social mobility. When a lot of other institutions do it, it's perceived as simply looking after their own interests. And I think I'd love to hear in kind of the question and answer session kind of, you know, how you perceive that challenge, and if there's more that we can do as government to kind of deal with that criticism. I think the second challenge for you as a set of HE providers is that despite your contribution to helping people acquire skills and knowledge during higher education, people who go into higher education from lower socioeconomic groups still have lower earnings after their degree than those from higher socioeconomic groups. Higher education currently fails to be a leveler. Now, we can't hold you responsible for all of that, obviously. There's clearly lots of other things going on there. There's class, there's social networks, there's a whole bunch of other things. But I think that is a really significant challenge that the higher education sector, I know, is trying to engage with, but what else do you potentially need to do for your students who are from lower socioeconomic groups to ensure that they have the best possible outcomes afterwards? Is that about more support for employability? Is that about more support for, you know, what's known as the softer skills? What is it that will make that difference and ensure that higher education genuinely is more of a leveler than it currently seems to be?
Emran, thank you very much indeed. The floor is now yours. Please indicate if you'd like to ask a question of the panellists. And when you do, could you possibly, since I won't necessarily put all the questions to all of the panellists, indicate who you particularly are aiming at or would like to answer your question, if I can put it that way. And it would also be useful to know your institution, if that is possible as well. So who would like to kick us off? By the way, I'm very short-sighted, so wave quite a bit when you put your hand up, otherwise I won't spot you. Yes, thank you very much. That's a very good wave.
Oh, hello. Graham Slater, UCFB. It's not really a question as such, but I just wanted to respond to some of Emran's comments. Because I do think as a recruiting institution, it sometimes feels a bit disheartening to be sort of told that, yes, you're helping with social responsibility, you're helping with access, but actually it's the wrong kind of access. Or it's not necessarily the goal of the sector, it's not what we're looking for. But just to kind of respond to your question about what that means for us and, you know, how we separate it from a business activity. I mean, for us at UCFB, we are primarily based on football, and it's mainly the sports industry. So for us, social responsibility is actually about getting girls into the game. So while the rest of the sector is actively trying to recruit young, white, working-class males, we're actually trying to say to girls and females that actually you should be empowered to come and work in the sector, and you should see the sports industry as something for you. And, you know, without wanting to speak on behalf of other institutions, I know other institutions with a similar ethos of music or games or other sectors which are traditionally male-dominated are kind of going against the flow in HE sector and looking for females. So it's not really a question as such. Just wanted to respond to those comments from Emran.
Thank you. Sorry, did you want anyone in particular to respond to it? I missed that part of your... maybe I'll ask Les to...
I think that's a very good point, and if I can turn it into a general point and link it too with what Claire said about the importance of context. I'm sometimes accused in the Daily Mail of running around the country setting higher education providers targets that they must meet. I actually do not do that. I ask higher education providers who want an access agreement to set their own targets in their own context. Now, I may go back and challenge them and say, is this appropriate? Is this challenging enough? This is going to be a bit easy to achieve. I want to see something a bit stronger there. But basically, we say to people, set your own targets. You know your clientele. So if you take your point about getting more women into football, then that is a perfectly legitimate target for you to set. We'd want to see the level of challenge in it and the motivation in it. We might also want to see some other targets. I don't think we'd accept that as just the only target if you were pushing for an access and participation plan. And but I think it really is important to celebrate the diversity of the higher education sector that we have in this country, and to realise that because of that, one size doesn't fit all. More than that, it is not a sensible policy to try and make everybody the same, to try and make everybody an elite institution, to try and make everybody, I guess there's not an argument out there that says everybody should be a football college, but you see what I mean.
Thank you very much. Who else down there was trying to ask a question? Yes.
Hi, Roxanne Stockwell from Pearson College, London. You sort of defined social mobility, at least for this audience, at least in part, being going to university. And I was wondering if you think the problem lies more in institutions being selective and therefore not selecting what people often call WP students, or do you think it's more just that the students don't want to go to university? Because you'd have two completely different strategies for those.
Thanks. And I think I'm going to ask all three panellists to very briefly comment on that, because it's an interesting question. But was there anyone you particularly was aiming at?
No, everybody.
Great. Emran, do you want to start on that one, and then Claire, and then Les?
Yeah.
So I think you're right to caution us not to perceive higher education as being the only route to social mobility. I think that must be right. Nevertheless, I think it's clear that there is a lot of evidence to support the contention that going to higher education is a very, very strong route to achieving social mobility. And, you know, that's for all kinds of reasons, but it's partly also due to the structure of our economy. And you know, that we have a lot of graduate level jobs. And so I think I'm a bit wary of the argument that says we shouldn't treat higher education as the be-all and end-all. I think that's right, we mustn't. But I don't think we can use that as an excuse to stop worrying about who goes to higher education. And I think while apprenticeships and other technical routes can in themselves help social mobility a great deal, I think the evidence suggests that a lot of them have much weaker returns, at least at the moment, than higher education does.
Claire.
So I remember being interviewed on A-level results day and being asked a question a little bit like the one you've just asked from a reporter. And I remember saying, and it was more from instinct than anything else, it's about the right choice for you, because I do think it's about choice. And so I agree in terms of, you know, higher education isn't the only route to social mobility, but having the choice to go into higher education, you then may choose to do something different with your life. But I think it's raising that level of aspiration, that you see it as a choice in the first place, is really fundamental. And to the part of your question that talks about aspiration versus entry, I think you were sort of getting at that. I go back to the story of my 9-year-old, and you know, most of them, it's a fairly affluent little rural school, but even in that, in a effectively a year of 15, there are 2 or 3 of his friends that have written it off. You know, at 9 years old, to have written off that this is the idea, you know, potentially something you could do when you're 17, 18. And so getting right back to what's the aspiration as we come through primary and secondary, I think is absolutely fundamental. And you have to do that as well as looking at different targets around entry to higher education. I think it's both in answer to your question.
Thank you. Les.
Well, agreeing with both of those answers, I have to be careful in this area, as you probably know, Roxanne. I once did say to a journalist that, well, of course, university isn't for everyone. For some people, an apprenticeship might be the best route. And then I got severely attacked by Andrew Adonis, which, is, you know, is very painful.
It's not difficult to be attacked by Andrew these days, actually.
But I have learnt that the best way to stop those people who say go on about apprenticeships is to say, is that what your child or your grandchild is going to do? Apprenticeships seem to be for other people's children and not for your own, because of course most people know that graduating and obtaining a degree is a powerful driver of success. It means you're more likely to be in a high-paid job. you're less likely to be unemployed. If you are, you're more likely to bounce back into a job. We know you're less likely to suffer mental illness or indeed physical illness. You're likely to score higher on the happy index, and all of those things that follow from being a graduate. So I think we are right to advocate the value and importance of higher education, particularly in a society where the economy is hollowing out. I grew up near to Luton, where I had my last proper job, and when I was at school, the big aspiration was to be an apprentice of Vauxhall's. And if your dad worked at Vauxhall's, then you were better off than everybody else on the estate where I grew up. Now, of course, those jobs don't exist anymore at Vauxhall's. Not that we don't make cars in this country, don't make them in Luton, but the highly skilled job of assembling a car is now done by a robot, because it's much better at doing that level of skill. And there are new jobs, of course, elsewhere in the economy, graduate jobs that Emran has referred to, and we know the growth in employment in this country will be in the graduate area. So we're right to advocate the importance of higher education, and that then brings the challenge, doesn't it, to us about getting the message out to parts of our society who still think that apprenticeships will lead to a great job at Vauxhall's, who still think that the traditional routes still exist in a labour market when they no longer do, to explain the importance of exploiting your potential as much as you can, working on your human potential and developing as much as you can. It's not just that this country is becoming more competitive, but globally we're becoming really competitive. You know, it would be great if we could take all of our kids to China to see how hard they work there, and to realise how competitive an economy, a global economy, they're going to have to live and work in the future.
Great, thank you, Liz. Yes, gentleman in the front, and then lady there. Yes. Oh, sorry, the microphone is on its way.
Hi, I'm Ben from Hot Courses. I just wanted to ask the question. Kind of frame it in this sense. We've talked a lot about social mobility to do with essentially the youth, but it needn't be a linear projection, right? I mean, social mobility should be the opportunity to move around no matter what situation you're in. At what point do we need to really sort of grab this narrative and inject it into the way we discuss these points? Because I think, Les, you mentioned earlier the advent of more robots taking on jobs and things like that. That implies to me that there'll be a bigger group of adults who need to then gain more skills and re-educate themselves in a certain way so that it can go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm probably going to sort of direct that one to Emran, but can I also take that question from the lady there, because there were a couple of other people, and I want to try and get those in before we have our keynote speech from Nick Hillman.
Hi, I'm Julia Begbie, KLC School of Design, and this is also for Emran. I was wondering what practical steps government is taking to help that we could engage with, because we used to have a great project that we did with secondary schools locally, working with AIM Higher coordinators, but they don't appear to be around anymore. It was enormously great fun, and we'd love to engage again. So what can we join in with?
Great, thank you. Emran, do you mind if I ask you to take those two, and then I shall deploy the rest of the panellists on the final questions, because there were a number of other people who had their hands up as well.
Sure. So on the first one, adults and lifelong learning, I mean, completely agree. We're living longer, our economy is changing, possibly changing faster than it has for a while. Impending exit from the EU is going to, bring some of our skills gaps into real focus, and all of this is happening on the back of a period during which adult learning has been in decline, both in FE and in HE because of the drop in part-time higher education. So there's some quite significant things here that we need to turn around. government announced some steps at budget to kind of expand this, to begin creating what we're calling a national retraining scheme, and some kind of early pots of money to kind of develop that. But I think there's definitely a lot more to do on that. And you know, we're about to introduce maintenance loans for part-time higher education. I think it'd be good to see what impact that has, and there might be more that we need to kind of think about there as well. On the second question around what are we doing as a government that kind of providers can engage with, I think you're right to mention kind of Aim Higher, in the sense that one of the things that kind of Aim Higher did well was it created a collaborative environment around how you kind of raise aspirations of young people. And the new National Collaborative Outreach Programme, which the Higher Education Funding Council is running, which will then be taken over by the Office for Students, is an attempt to kind of do something similar in a new set of circumstances, so to get universities to work together in localities. And so I think that would be the thing to focus on, the National Collaborative Outreach Programme, which is kind of creating hubs in different parts of the country. So I think find the hub that's closest to you and have a conversation with them.
Great. I think there were 2 or 3 other hands up. Could we just take those very quickly all together, and then we'll come to the panellists, and then we'll need to move on to the next session. So a couple of people down there, and then right at the back. If you can try to keep your questions quite short, because we're...
Yes, Samuel is my name. Lagos State Polytechnic, Nigeria. Mr. Emran, in the course of your presentation, you may mention that higher education fails to be a leveler. So what do you think is the leveler now?
Thank you very much. And the gentleman next to you.
My name is Carl Courtney from the London School of Business and Management. We are presenting a model of education, predominantly in this country, that was designed for people of leisure. And we're asking widening participation students to fit into it. And very often what they need is flexibility, and that also requires flexibility in student funding. And who's arguing the case for a more flexible system? I understand there's plans afoot to make maintenance loans available to part-time students, but I think the flexibility we require is much greater than that. Is anyone arguing the case to make student funding more flexible, and the delivery of programs, indeed, more flexible to suit these widening participation lives?
Thank you. And then I'm going to take the 2 questions at the back, and then I'm going to come to each of the panellists in turn to respond as they think appropriate to the questions relevant to them.
Thank you. Paul Kirkham, Chief Executive, ICMP. I may have misunderstood Mr. Eberden's previous comments, but you seem to be putting everything that's not a university degree into some kind of second tier of value, which would rather undermine certainly the degree apprenticeship schemes. But are you not making the same mistake that generations have been making, which is defining higher education as being a university degree, which therefore completely undermines everything which is not a university degree and forces everybody down the same route? Thank you.
Okay, and was there one other question at the back? Yes, we'll take that one, and then we'll come to the panellists. No? No? Okay. In that case, I'm going to come to the panellists, Emran, Claire, and then Les. Les, can you finish for us as well on an optimistic note when you make your comments by telling us the most effective, exciting access agreement from a university you've seen over your time? You can name the university if you want to give them glory, or you can talk about the characteristics of it if you want to be shy. So actually, let's have some variety. Claire, and then Emran, and then Les.
So I'll just pick up on 2 points. So to the gentleman at the back, I absolutely, I go back to the right choice for you. I've got 2 stepsons who didn't go into higher education, and that was the right choice for them at the time. I'm in active conversations with a number of universities around degree apprenticeships. Actually, I think degree apprenticeships are going to be super, super competitive in terms of them being employer-led and having a salary while you're studying. So I think the plurality that we're seeing is actually very encouraging. And I do think, higher education is a route to social mobility, but it isn't the only route. route. And I do go back, you know, my stepsons are now past 17, but if I was going through that again, and when I go through it with my 9-year-old, it is the right choice for you. And I think one of the things as Chief Exec of UCAS that I'm talking to my staff about is about that information advice being a sort of one-stop shop, that you can see all of those different options. So I entirely support, I think, what the sentiment behind the point you were making. I think in terms of the flexible programmes, flexible student funding, I suppose the only thing I would say on there, and it picks up a point about mature students, I think earlier on, and perhaps about adult learning, is that it's one of the things that really has struck me since coming in here, that we talk a lot about the 17, 18-year-olds, and me and Les were talking when we first met a couple of months ago, but even just before this session, about understanding that more, because I go back to, if you understand it, you then will be able to address what might work, rather than sort of flinging solutions at a problem you don't fully understand. So that's where I would start.
Thank you. Emran.
So on the question around whether I'm trying to force everybody down the same route, I think the only thing I'd add to what Claire said was that I think let's not underestimate the level of diversity in higher education itself. So even going into higher education is not going into a single uniform route. What is taught in higher education is massively diverse, and there's massive amounts of vocational training essentially that happens in higher education as well. And then the kind of the question around flexibility, I think the point is well made. We are testing as part of our reform program. You know, we have consulted on whether there are things we can do to improve credit transfer, to have more sort of movement, you know, between institutions during the course of a degree, and equally looking at kind of accelerated degrees, 2-year programs. So I think the point of flexibility is well made.
Thank you. And Les, the final word to you.
Can I echo those comments about flexibility? I talk a lot about the vanilla student, and it seems to me the student funding system is the cause of a lot of our problems. It assumes that everybody studies in the same way. It even assumes if you're a part-time student, you're part of a full-time student, and my experience with part-timers is that they're looking for particular modules and particular pieces of learning rather than necessarily a degree. And part of the reason for that 61% decline is because we've tried to force people to do something they don't want to do. So I would be a very strong advocate of looking for more flexibility. Of course, that brings more complexity in, and one of the things we have to watch for is that we don't make the student loans company fall over, because there are lots of students who depend on that, and it's easy to say these things without thinking about the practicalities of operating a system for several million students, and the number of changes that we keep on advocating has to have a limit, but strongly support that. Look, I've got used in this job to people putting words in my mouth, and I used to get terribly upset, and now I just see it as an opportunity to clarify. I would have thought, with the personal record I have in terms of supporting diversity in higher education, actually practically being involved in it myself, think of numbers of diploma and certificate students that I've taught as well. The comments that I got into a lot of trouble about supporting apprenticeships and particularly obviously degree level apprenticeships, I would want to reassure you that I don't see being a graduate as the only way that people are going to go, or to push everybody into a certain pattern of higher education. If you look at the national strategy for access and participation, it actually says that it's about the right experience for the individual, and that's got to be the watchword. But obviously it is my job to make sure the barriers are dismantled to people going into higher education. And that's what I'm passionate about, because it transformed my life. I want to give other people opportunity to do that as well. So I will carry on advocating for higher education, but I will also carry on advocating for a flexible, person-centred approach to it.
Do you want to name a fan?
Well, I don't think I will name a particular institution. I've always tried to avoid that, which is quite helpful when it comes to particular institutions being in the focus of the press. I can say I don't get involved with particular institutions. But the ones who are most successful in access and participation are those who take a whole institution approach to it. It's an integral part of their strategy. It's not some added on extra that a couple of people do from a hut on the edge of the campus or a little part of the marketing department does. The whole institution believes passionately that people should have the opportunity and works hard to provide that, both in terms of outreach programs that are adapted to the context of the institution, work in partnership with the schools or the communities that they're working with, and carries on through the educational process, because disadvantage doesn't stop at the higher education provider's door. It carries on through, and it carries on into employment, and so works across the whole of the stages of the education process. And I'd have to say, because that's expensive, it has to be targeted, and therefore seeks out the targets which are challenging and where you can make the most difference to people by working with them.
Good, thank you. That is a good point on which to end. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for all of your questions. And on your behalf, can I thank very much indeed Les, Claire and Emran for their presentations. Thank you.